The CAC Wirraway was a training and multi-purpose aircraft made in Australia that was pressed into combat at this country's darkest hour in the Second World War, becoming one of the protagonists of some of the most dire and epic moments of Australia's war. In 1928, Sir John Salmond, Marshal of the Royal Air Force, was requested to create a document that would dictate the future of the Royal Australian Air Force, giving it the tools to defend the country from outside aggression. However, this document, adequately known as the Salmond Report, wasn't implemented until 1936, partially due to the Great Depression. Australia decided to enact it in response to the general increase in tensions, as well as the announcement of the British Royal Air Forces doubling in size. This increase would put pressure on the British aircraft industry, which was Australia's main source of aircraft, leading to the belief that the Australian Air Force could no longer rely on it to meet its growing needs. And so it was that the decision to create an Australian aircraft industry was taken. The objectives were humble initially, the creation of factories in order to build 40 general-purpose, low-wing metal-skin monoplanes with a retractable landing gear and a variable pitch propeller. For this purpose, on October 17, 1936, a few large Australian companies joined forces to create the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation, or CAC. This in turn led to the creation of the first factory at Fisherman's Bend in Melbourne, which became operational in September of 1937. Meanwhile, the Australians went looking for an aircraft to be the basis of a new project, and, after a commissioned search for it in Europe and in the US, the North American NA-16-2K, also known as NA-33, was chosen. The NA-16 was the first trainer aircraft made by the North American Aviation Company, and its design would lead to some of the most successful trainers in the world, such as the T-6 Texan. The Australians chose the NA-16 mainly due to the simplicity of both aircraft and engine, since this proven technology would pose few problems to their fledgling industry. Nonetheless, the picking of an American aircraft led to protests, since it was considered unpatriotic to choose an airplane from outside the Commonwealth, but still, the idea went ahead. The new aircraft was named Wirraway, an Aboriginal word meaning challenge, and it had a large number of differences from the NA-16. Those included an increase in weaponry. It now had two synchronized Vickers Mark V machine guns firing from the fuselage ahead of the cockpit and a single defensive Vickers GO machine gun in the rear cockpit. It could also take 500 pounds in bombs or 1000 in an overload configuration. The wings and stabilizers were strengthened to allow dive bombing, but it only received dive brakes at a later time with the Mark III variant. It had a crew of two, a pilot and a gunner/bomb aimer in the back, and it was powered by a Pratt & Whitney R1340 Wasp 9-cylinder air-cooled radial engine that could produce 650 horsepower at takeoff or 600 at 7,000 feet. It drove a 3-bladed DH variable pitch propeller. But after the project became more defined, there were some doubts regarding its purpose, especially after a report compiled in June 1938 by the Marshal of the Royal Air Force, Sir Edward Ellington, where it could be read: "I consider that the Wirraway should be regarded as a temporary expedient. It can only be regarded as an advanced training aircraft." This report led to several angry reactions and a lot of discussion between the Australian government and the Air Board. But, despite the negative outlook, the Wirraway became the first aircraft to be mass-produced in Australia. It flew for the first time on March 27, 1939, and delivery started in July. In the last days of August, just before the outbreak of war, the RAAF had 246 aircraft available, of which 7 were Wirraways. During the first years of the war, the Wirraway was mostly used as a training aircraft, a role that it filled very competently. This led to an increase in orders both by the Australian government and later by the British, who ordered 500 units. But this was before the signing of the Lend-Lease Act, and further ahead the British would cancel this order. On December 6, 1941, the day before the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Royal Australian Air Force had 536 combat aircraft. Of those, 209 were Wirraways. The only aircraft that could be considered a frontline fighter available to the RAAF were the 28 Brewster Buffaloes that were stationed in Malaya and Singapore. Consequently, the increasing possibility of Japan invading mainland Australia led to the fateful decision of sending No. 24 Squadron to Rabaul, on the island of New Britain, to try and halt a Japanese expansion into the South Pacific. This squadron was equipped with a mix of Hudsons and Wirraways, and it was to be the sole air defense against enemy bombers. So it was that the Wirraway was pressed to the front line as an emergency fighter, but it soon became clear that it was highly inadequate in that role. During the period between December 8 and January 19, 1942, the Wirraways belonging to the No. 24 Squadron were unable to intercept the Japanese bombers and recon planes that frequently visit Rabaul. This was either by lack of speed, the inadequacy of its 2 rifle-caliber machine guns, or the inability to climb to their altitude, even with early warning given by coast watchers. But the worst was yet to come, when on January 20, no less than 4 Japanese aircraft carriers approached Rabaul from the north. These unleashed more than 100 aircraft led by 18 Zeros flown by some of the most experienced airmen in the world. In an undoubtedly very courageous action, 8 Wirraways scrambled to oppose the Japanese raid. The result was disastrous, with 1 Wirraway lost in an accident and 5 being quickly shot down or forced to land in a variety of ways. Only 2 were serviceable after the attack, and it was all for naught, as the Japanese lost no aircraft to their action. Captain David Selby, who watched everything from the ground, described the event as desperate gallantry, and this later became one of the most emblematic moments of the Australian forces and their courage during the Second World War. This event isn't considered an act of bravery only because the Australians were outnumbered more than 2 to 1 or because the Japanese pilots were more experienced. There was also a huge difference between the A6M20 and the CAC Wirraway. The A6M2 was about 100 miles per hour faster at sea level and at altitude. It also vastly outclimbed the Australian aircraft. In addition, it also had far superior armament with its 2 20mm cannons. Overall, those Australian airmen didn't have a chance, and they must have known it. To add insult to injury, Rabaul fell 3 days later. Still, there was one positive outcome of this engagement. The Wirraway stopped being used as a fighter, even as an emergency one. The Australian aircraft had seen some action in Malaya, where it had achieved better results in a close support role. Nonetheless, after the defense of Rabaul, the Wirraway became mostly restricted to training missions. It seemed that its operational life was at an end, when one of its flaws, its slow speed, allowed a return to the front lines. In the second half of 1942, ground fighting in New Guinea intensified, and the need for an aircraft that was able to support the army soon grew. The dense jungle of New Guinea and the poor visibility it afforded from the air meant that there was a high risk of friendly fire from supporting airplanes, and a fast aircraft would have a harder time spotting or hitting anything below. The fact that the Wirraway had a very low wing loading, coincidentally about the same as the Japanese Zero, meant that it had a low stall speed and a good maneuverability. In addition, it had a second crewman in the back. These characteristics made it a good candidate for supporting Allied troops advancing through the jungle. The Wirraway-equipped No. 4 Squadron arrived at Port Moresby in November 1942, and it successfully performed missions like aerial reconnaissance, artillery spotting, supply dropping, or close air support. The Australian aircraft became a jack of all trades, and served with distinction in New Guinea. But even in aerial combat there was still some success to be had. On the 26th of December 1942, a Wirraway flown by Flying Officer J.S. Archer with Sergeant J.L. Colston as observer departed Dobodura for a reconnaissance mission over Gona. Later, an enemy Ki-43 Oscar was sighted flying 1,000 feet below. Diving on the unsuspecting enemy pilot, Archer opened up with a 5-second burst from above. The Ki-43 plunged into the sea below, as it seems the Japanese pilot was hit and killed outright. The Australians back at Dobodura became elated, and a famous report was made. Archer has shot down 1 Zeke. Repeat, 1 Zeke. Send 6 bottles beer. This was the only air victory achieved by a Wirraway. Beyond the Army cooperation role, the Wirraway had a dedicated dive bomber variant, the Mark III, which saw considerable use in maritime patrols against Japanese submarines. But, despite these successes, the Wirraway was gradually replaced in the front lines by other aircraft such as the CAC Boomerang. The Boomerang was a fighter aircraft that was directly developed from the Wirraway, and this was another of its important legacies, but it is beyond the scope of this video. When the Second World War came to an end, over 400 Wirraways were still being used as trainers, and they kept being operated in this fashion by the RAAF until 1959. This shows how important it was in the Empire Air Training Scheme and the instruction of new pilots. As the first product of the Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation, the Wirraway wasn't certainly the last, since during roughly the period of the Second World War, 248 Boomerangs, 200 Wackets and 59 P-51s were produced in addition to the 755 Wirraways. The Australian adventure of creating, from the ground up and in little more than 3 years, an aeronautical industry was something of a feat. Little did the Australians know that the results would be of great consequence in an upcoming war. This absence of experience led to some lack of definition during the creation of the Wirraway, and it ended up becoming something quite unique. Unfortunately, the Rabaul debacle threw a shade on it, but it's important to note that the Australians only pressed the Wirraway to the front line due to a total lack of other fighters, which was only solved months later with the long overdue arrival of American P-40 Warhawks. These were so late that the Australians nicknamed them Never Hawks and Tomorrow Hawks. Later, the Australians were able to find a place for the Wirraway, and it was in the small and unusual tasks in New Guinea that it actually succeeded, making it valuable and endearing to the Australian Armed Forces. That ends, naturally, the fact that it was homemade. On a personal level, I have the utmost respect for the Australians for having made their own stuff. Finally, addressing the most important topic, those Australians back at Dobudura did receive the 6 bottles of beer they requested. Thank you very much for watching. Remember to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this content. I will see you again soon.